There are certain places you walk into willingly, completely convinced you are safe, maybe even convinced you are growing, and all the while, something inside you is quietly being taken apart, not dramatically. Not all at once, slowly, piece by piece. And the most terrifying part of all of it is this: you will not feel it happening. You will actually feel comfortable. You will feel understood. You will feel like you finally found the right people, the right environment, the right path forward. And none of that will be true. Most people spend their entire lives trying to protect themselves from the wrong threats. They are watching the horizon for the dramatic collapse. They are bracing for the sudden, obvious catastrophe, the market crash, the betrayal they can see coming, the enemy who makes themselves known. But that is not how real ruin works. Real ruin does not announce itself. It does not kick down the door. It gets invited inside. And once it is in, it decorates the room so beautifully that you never want it to leave. Niccolò Machiavelli spent his entire life watching powerful men fall. He studied the psychology behind why brilliant, capable, motivated people end up defeated, diminished, and forgotten, not because their enemies were stronger, but because of the specific environments those people kept choosing to inhabit. The places they returned to day after day that felt productive, felt safe, felt necessary, but were in reality slowly consuming everything that made them dangerous, everything that made them capable, everything that made them free. If you have been feeling stuck lately, if you have been putting in the effort but not seeing the movement, if you have been trying harder but somehow falling further behind, I need you to stay with me for the next few minutes, because what I am about to share with you is going to reframe the way you see almost every relationship, every environment, and every habit in your life. And if this kind of thinking speaks to you, if you are the type of person who wants to understand power, psychology, and strategy at a level most people never even attempt, then make sure you are subscribed to the Silent Strategist. There's much more where this is coming from. Now, let us talk about the first place. There's a specific kind of room that almost every person on Earth has walked into at some point. It might look like a group of close friends gathered around a table. It might look like an online community where everyone seems to get it. It might look like a late-night conversation with the one person who always seems to understand your frustration. The common thread running through all of it is this: in this room, failure is never personal. Failure is always someone else's fault. The economy did it, the system did it, the people at the top did it, and everyone in the room nods. Everyone validates. Everyone pours another drink and agrees that yes, and it is one of the most psychologically destructive places a human being can plant themselves in for any extended period of time. Here is why it works so effectively. When you are hurting, when a plan has fallen apart, or someone has genuinely treated you badly, there is a deep neurological need for acknowledgement. You are not weak for wanting that. That is a human thing. The trap is not in seeking acknowledgement. The trap is in the specific flavor of acknowledgement this environment offers. Because what this environment does is not simply acknowledge your pain. It reframes your pain as proof of victimhood. It takes the raw, honest experience of a setback and transforms it into a permanent identity. You stopped being someone who experienced a failure and became someone who was failed upon. That is not a small distinction. That is the difference between a person moving through life and a person anchored to the worst moments of it. Machiavelli observed, across decades of watching both rulers and ordinary men, that the human tendency to credit external forces for our failures and claim personal genius for our successes is one of the most reliable sources of long-term stagnation. He watched Florence's own Piero Soderini, a genuinely decent man, a thoughtful leader, surround himself with idealists and moralists who reinforced his belief that being good was enough, that the rightness of his cause would protect him from the violence of reality. It did not. When the Medici came with an army, Soderini sat in his inner circle of high-minded advisors and waited for moral justice to intervene. It never did. He was removed, exiled, and died in irrelevance. His goodness, surrounded and amplified by people who told him his goodness was sufficient, became his blind spot. The people in these grievance environments are not evil. That is important to understand. Most of them are genuinely hurting, but they have made a choice, usually unconscious, to organize their identity around that hurt. And when you begin to heal, when you begin to move, when you begin to take accountability and generate results, you become a threat. Not because they dislike you, but because your progress is a mirror they do not want held up to them. Your growth implies that the cage was always open. Your escape means the story they have been telling themselves about why they are still in place was never fully true. And so, subtly, gradually, the environment will begin to pull you back. More sympathy, more validation, more reasons why trying is naive and the system always wins anyway. Sympathy feels like love. But sympathy from the wrong source, for the wrong reasons, at the wrong time, is a sedative. It numbs the exact pain you need to feel in order to change. Pain is information. It is the body and mind's most honest feedback system. When you let an environment deaden that signal for you, you stop learning from your own experience. You stop growing, you just stop. If the people around you are not actively engaged in the arena, if they are not taking swings, absorbing losses, and getting back up, then bringing your real battles into their space will cost you more than it gives you. The first step out of this environment is the moment you stop seeking a pat on the back for a failure and start asking yourself, what exactly does this setback tell me? And what am I going to do differently? That is a question the grievance environment is structurally incapable of helping you answer. Now, the second environment is in some ways far more dangerous because unlike the first one, which at least carries the faint smell of defeat, the second one smells like success. It feels like momentum. It feels like you are finally being recognized. And that feeling is exactly what makes it lethal. Think about the last time someone told you that your idea was brilliant. Think about how that felt in your chest. Think about the small but unmistakable sense of satisfaction and relief and validation that moved through you in that moment. That sensation is real. The neurochemistry behind it is completely genuine. Your brain processed that compliment and delivered a measurable reward. The problem is that the brain does not distinguish between the reward of being told your idea is great and the reward of actually executing the idea and producing results. It just registers reward. It releases dopamine. And dopamine does not care whether you earned it or whether someone handed it to you for free. When you inhabit an environment that consistently praises your potential rather than your output, your brain begins to feel satisfied by the idea of what you could become rather than driven by the gap between where you are and where you need to be. You become, in the most precise psychological sense, full, and a full person does not hunt. A full person sits still. A full person waits for the next compliment, the next affirmation, the next round of applause for simply existing in the vicinity of a good idea. Machiavelli wrote about this with an urgency that feels almost visceral even centuries later. He watched courts fill up with men who had learned that telling the prince what he wanted to hear was far safer and more rewarding than telling him what he needed to hear. And he watched princes, one after another, become soft, complacent, and completely blindsided by reality because the feedback loop around them had been curated to produce only comfort. He warned with uncommon bluntness that courts are always full of flatterers. Always, because flattery works. It works on kings. It works on executives. It works on people with millions of followers and people with none. The historical case he would have pointed to most readily was King Perseus of Macedon. Perseus inherited enormous resources, a battle-hardened military, a wealthy empire, centuries of accumulated power and prestige. He also surrounded himself with men who told him that his genius was predetermined, that Rome was overextended and vulnerable. They said the gods themselves had written his victory in advance. These men were not his enemies. They were his closest advisors, his most trusted companions. And every word they said to him was quietly, systematically dismantling his capacity for honest self-assessment. When Perseus finally met the Roman legions at Pydna, the encounter lasted roughly an hour. His army, which his court had declared invincible, was destroyed. he fled the battlefield in tears, blaming his generals, blaming fortune, blaming everything except the years he had spent living inside a reality his flatterers had constructed for him. The environment that praises you endlessly is fattening you for slaughter. It is not doing this maliciously in most cases. It is simply the nature of what happens when comfort replaces honest feedback, and the fix is genuinely uncomfortable. You have to seek out spaces where your past accomplishments buy you nothing, where the standards are ruthless, where the people around you are operating at a level that makes you feel in the best possible way like a beginner. That feeling of being small, of being challenged, of having your assumptions dismantled, that is not an insult. That is the only environment where real sharpening happens. The sword does not become sharp in a case lined with velvet. It becomes sharp against stone. If you have been nodding along to any of this, drop a comment below. Tell me which of these environments you have spent the most time in. I read every single one. And if this is landing for you so far, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the conversations this kind of thinking starts are worth having. Now we move into the third place. And this one has probably claimed more wasted potential than any other environment on this list, because it does not even look like a place of failure. It looks like the most responsible, most intelligent, most mature thing a person could possibly be doing. There is a room that serious, ambitious people build for themselves. It is filled with books. It is covered in notes. It has whiteboards with systems mapped out on them. It has folders with research, plans, frameworks, strategies. It is lit by a screen at 2 in the morning as the person inside it reads one more article, watches one more breakdown, listens to one more expert explain the mechanics of success. This person is not lazy. Do not confuse them with lazy. They are working extremely hard. The tragedy is not a lack of effort. The tragedy is that none of that effort is touching reality. All of it is happening in a completely controlled, completely consequence-free environment where nothing can go wrong because nothing is actually happening. Machiavelli described fortune as a violent river. When the water is calm, he said, you build your channels and your dams. But when the flood comes, you cannot calculate your way through it. You have to move. You have to act. The man who is still measuring the current while the water rises around him is not being careful. He is drowning in his own methodology. The reason this environment is so seductive is precisely because it feels productive. Every piece of new information feels like progress. Every course completed, every framework absorbed, every competitor analyzed feels like one step closer to being ready. But ready is a moving target. Ready does not exist as a destination. You do not arrive at ready. You discover through action whether you are ready, and usually you discover that you are more capable than you thought. And also that there were things you could never have anticipated from the inside of a planning room. The gap between theory and execution is always larger than it looks on paper. Always. Not. Sometimes. Always. There is a historical parallel here that is almost painful to look at directly. The condottieri of 15th century Italy. The professional mercenary captains included among their ranks some of the most technically educated military minds of their era. They had studied the ancient Roman formations. They understood siege mechanics. They could quote military theory across generations. Some of them genuinely believed their preparation had made them invincible. Then they met opponents who had nothing but raw, ferocious survival-level aggression. The theory did not survive contact, it rarely does. The reason perfectionism persists, despite being demonstrably counterproductive, is that it is not really about standards. Standards are things that improve your output. Perfectionism is about protection. It is the psychological mechanism that keeps you from ever being honestly judged, because you never fully commit to a result. You are always in progress, always optimizing, always one more iteration from launch. And as long as you are always about to begin, you can never be said to have failed. To break out of this place requires something almost violent in its simplicity. You have to ship something imperfect. You have to speak before the sentence is finished in your head. You have to enter the arena at 70% ready, and trust that the remaining 30% will either appear through action or turn out not to have been necessary. Momentum is, as Machiavelli argued, something close to sacred. It creates its own conditions. It generates its own information. A person moving imperfectly through the world gathers more real-world data in a single week than a person planning perfectly gathers in a year. Stop building the map. Start moving through the territory. And now the fourth place. This one does not trap you through comfort or flattery or planning paralysis. This one traps you by bending your compass. It does not stop you from moving. It just makes sure you're always moving in the wrong direction. We live inside the most sophisticated comparison machine ever built. It is in our hands every single day. And unlike the comparison environments of previous centuries, where you might measure yourself against a neighbor or a colleague, the modern version allows you to measure yourself against a globally curated highlight reel of the most extreme outliers of success, wealth, appearance, and achievement. And to do this dozens or hundreds of times per day, every single day, with no context, no backstory, and no honest accounting of what you are actually looking at. Machiavelli understood the danger of surface-level imitation. He watched rulers try to copy the strategies of other rulers, without any understanding of the conditions, advantages, relationships, or even luck that had made those strategies work in their original context. He saw men abandon their genuine strengths, the things that actually made them competitive and dangerous, to pursue an approach that looked successful on someone else, because they had mistaken the appearance of a method for its substance. The story of Carthage is instructive here in a way that should feel uncomfortable if you are honest about it. Carthage was, for generations, the supreme maritime power of the ancient world. Their navy was unmatched. Their wealth flowed from trade routes they controlled completely. Their identity, their infrastructure, their institutional knowledge, all of it was built around the sea. Then they began fighting Rome, and as they watched Rome win on land, something happened. The comparison infected their strategic thinking. They began envying Rome's territorial control. They began pouring resources into competing on Rome's terms, in Rome's preferred theater, using Rome's preferred methods. They abandoned the ocean to fight on the ground. They tried to become Rome, and in doing so they became neither themselves nor Rome, a pale, overextended imitation of an enemy who was fighting from its deepest strength. Carthage was destroyed so thoroughly that the Romans salted the earth where the city had stood to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. When you allow comparison to drive your decisions, when you pivot your approach because of a trend, restructure your strategy because of what someone else seems to be winning with, buy things you cannot afford to project a status you have not yet earned, you are doing the same thing. You are salting your own ground. You are abandoning the specific, real, developed advantages you actually have in order to compete on someone else's terms. And that is a competition you will always lose, because you will always be a secondary version of someone who built that approach from the inside out, while you are operating it as an outsider who copied the exterior. The only productive use of observation is cold, strategic, unemotional deconstruction. See what is working for someone. Ask why it is working. Ask whether the mechanics can be adapted to your specific context and your specific strengths. Strip away the emotion entirely. Turn their success into information rather than judgment, and then return your full attention to your own lane, the one where your specific capabilities, your specific knowledge, your specific experience make you genuinely formidable. Because when you compete from your actual strength rather than from a position of imitation, the equation changes completely. At this point in the conversation, if you have been carrying this with you, take a second and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach the people who need to hear it, and I mean that practically, not as a formality. Now we arrive at the fifth place, and this one requires a certain amount of honesty, because it disguises itself as something that feels not just acceptable, but actually admirable. It arrives dressed as generosity, as connection, as someone in your corner. It arrives at exactly the moments when you are most vulnerable and most in need. when the path gets hard and a door appears to open, when someone offers you an advantage, a shortcut, a resource you have not yet earned, there is a part of the human brain that registers this as fortune finally arriving, as the universe recognizing your worth, as evidence that things are about to turn around. And the warmth that comes with that feeling is genuine, but the cost attached to it is almost always invisible at first and enormous later. Machiavelli watched Cosimo de' Medici operate in Florence with what he considered a kind of awed admiration. Cosimo was not a warrior. He did not project physical power or aggressive dominance. He rode a mule, he dressed simply. He spoke humbly. And in the background, he ran a bank that was quietly, systematically, building invisible chains around every significant person in the city. He loaned money to nobles, to politicians, to merchants. He bailed out businesses. He paid off debts. He generated year after year a vast web of people who were in his debt, not officially, not visibly, but psychologically and financially in ways that shaped every decision they made going forward. He was called the father of the people, but the father owned the children. And when anyone dared to oppose him politically, he did not need to threaten them. He simply called in what was owed. Men who believed they were free, independent, powerful, men who had celebrated Cosimo's generosity in public, were quietly reduced to nothing by the very gifts they had gratefully accepted. And the mechanism here is guilt. And guilt, in the context of obligation, is one of the most effectively paralyzing psychological states a human being can experience, because it weaponizes your own sense of morality. It turns the best part of you, your decency, your loyalty, your desire to honor your commitments, into a leash. You stay in the situation that has long since stopped serving you because your internal ledger says you are in debt. You do not act on your own judgment because someone can stand behind you and say, with complete credibility, after everything I have done for you, the job that pays well but is offered by someone who expects unspoken loyalty, the funding that arrives from an investor who never explicitly stated their expectations but made them felt, the favor that seemed like pure generosity but arrives with a weight you only fully feel the first time you try to move in a direction the giver disapproves of. These are not always obvious traps. They are often offered by people who genuinely care about you and genuinely believe they are helping. The mechanism does not require malicious intent to function perfectly. It just requires that you accepted something without defining the terms. The principle that Machiavelli distilled from all of this is simple and uncomfortably demanding. You must be the one who gives. You must never be in the position of the one who receives something they cannot fully account for. When you are the creditor, you have leverage and freedom. When you are the debtor, even a willing, grateful debtor, your autonomy has a ceiling, and that ceiling is set by the person you owe. Pay the full price in effort, in money, in time. Take the stairs, suffer the delay. Define every exchange clearly and settle every account quickly. Because a person who owes nothing to anyone moves through the world in a way that the person carrying invisible debt simply cannot. And now we arrive at the final place, the sixth. And I want you to understand before I describe it, that this is the one that takes down the people who have already beaten everything else. The ones who escaped the grievance circle, the ones who stopped listening to the flatterers, the ones who broke out of endless planning, the ones who stopped comparing, the ones who kept their ledger clean. This is the trap that waits at the top. And it is baited with something that cuts directly to the deepest, most ancient part of the human brain. We are tribal animals. That is not a metaphor or a cultural observation. That is a biological reality. For the vast majority of human history, being rejected or excluded by the group was not a social inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Your survival depended on the village. And so the brain developed a powerful, deeply wired drive for approval, for belonging, for being perceived positively by the people around you. That drive is not a weakness. It is an inheritance. It served a genuine function for a very long time. The problem is that it now operates in a context it was never designed for, a world where the crowd is not your village, where the opinions being rendered about you come from millions of strangers who do not know your history, do not understand your context, and do not bear any consequence for their judgment of you. And yet the pull is real. The need to explain yourself when you are misunderstood. The desire to apologize when someone takes your actions the wrong way. The compulsion to make the narrative fair, to present your side, to prove that you are actually one of the good ones. Every one of these impulses is the ancient tribal brain trying to maintain your standing in a village that does not exist. And every time you give in to them, every time you write the long explanation, every time you issue the preemptive apology, every time you water down your position to be more digestible to more people, you are feeding a machine that will never, under any circumstances, be satisfied. The story of Girolamo Savonarola is one of the most chilling illustrations of what happens when a person or a leader builds their entire foundation on the approval of the public. Savonarola was a Dominican friar in late 15th century Florence who understood, with genuine sophistication, how to tap into public emotion. He preached with fire. He gave the people an enemy, luxury, corruption, moral decay, and he gave them the satisfaction of righteous anger. They loved him. They followed him. They brought their books, their mirrors, their fine clothing to the bonfires he organized in the public square, and they burned them with joy because he had convinced them that they were performing virtue in front of God and in front of one another. He rode the wave of collective approval with complete confidence. He believed the love of the people was a structural foundation. He forgot that the crowd does not love. The crowd feels. And feelings change. When the economic conditions of Florence shifted and the Pope moved against him politically, the crowd did not reason through the implications and maintain their position based on principle. They felt the change in the air and they moved with it. The same citizens who had wept at his sermons became bored with them, then annoyed by them, then actively hostile. They stormed his convent. They dragged him to the same public square where the bonfires had burned. They executed him in front of the crowd that had once called him a prophet. The public built his pedestal and then used the wood from that pedestal to construct his scaffold. When you live on the altar of public opinion, when you base your decisions on how they will be received, when you calibrate your moves to the expected reaction, when you flinch because a comment mischaracterized your intentions, you have handed the most important controls of your life to people who will never know you, who have no accountability for their influence, and who are responding to the most recent emotional current, rather than any sustained or accurate understanding of who you are and what you are building. The insight Machiavelli offers here is not cynicism, it is strategy. He wrote that a ruler must not fear being called cruel if that reputation serves the stability of the empire. A few clear, honest, non-negotiable actions that some will perceive as harsh will produce far less actual damage than a constant yielding to sentiment that prevents you from ever making a clean decision and executing it fully. Applied to your own psychology, you must become genuinely comfortable with being misunderstood, not resigned to it, not performing indifference. Actually comfortable with the fact that people operating from incomplete information will reach conclusions about you that are wrong, and that correcting those conclusions is almost always a worse use of your energy than simply continuing to build. When you cut a toxic relationship and the person tells their version of events to mutual friends, do not correct the narrative. When you raise your prices and the clients who cannot afford them say you have become arrogant, do not explain yourself. When you go silent to focus on execution and people who are accustomed to your attention say you have changed, let them be right. You have changed. That is the point. The silence you maintain in the face of public misunderstanding is not weakness. It is the clearest possible signal that you have stopped needing external validation to know the value of what you are doing. The weak correct rumors. The strong build track records. Now step back with me for a moment and look at what we have mapped together. The environment of shared grievance that trades your agency for sympathy. The environment of unearned praise that trades your hunger for comfort. The environment of endless planning that trades your momentum for the illusion of readiness. The environment of comparison that trades your authentic strategy for imitation. The environment of accumulated favor that trades your freedom for convenience. The environment of public approval that trades your psychological sovereignty for the impossible task of managing how strangers perceive you. 6 environments, 6 different mechanisms, 6 different flavors of the same fundamental outcome, a life lived at a fraction of its actual capacity, not because of a lack of talent or effort or even opportunity, but because of where that effort was being spent and what those environments were doing to the thinking that directed it. The thing I want you to sit with, the thing that I think is the most genuinely uncomfortable truth in all of this, is that none of these places look dangerous from the outside. That is not an accident. The most effective traps never do. The grievance circle looks like a support system. The flattery environment looks like recognition. The planning room looks like diligence. The comparison environment looks like ambition. The chamber of indebtedness looks like opportunity. The altar of public opinion looks like authenticity. They are designed by human psychology, by social dynamics, by the path of least resistance, to be entered willingly and exited reluctantly. And that means the responsibility sits entirely with you, not because that is fair, because that is reality. You cannot outwork the effect of a toxic environment. You cannot meditate your way to clarity if the space you return to every day is actively dismantling it. You cannot positively affirm your way out of a room that has been structurally designed to prevent the kind of honest self-confrontation that real growth requires. The only move that actually works is the same one that has always worked. You leave. You cure it. You build a ruthlessly honest audit of every environment, every relationship, every habit, every community, every digital space you regularly inhabit, and you ask one unforgiving question about each of them. Is this making me more capable, more clear, more honest, more dangerous in the best sense of that word? Or is it softening me in ways I have been too comfortable to admit? If something is softening you, cut it, not partially, not gradually, decisively. Yes, it will hurt. Yes, you will lose people. Yes, some of those people will be confused or angry or will say things about you that are not fair. And yes, the silence that follows when you have exited all 6 of these environments will be louder and more uncomfortable than you expect. Because the noise of those environments, the constant drama and validation seeking and planning and comparing and explaining, was filling a space inside you that you will now have to face directly. And in that space, if you can stay with the discomfort long enough, is where the only version of yourself that actually matters begins to emerge. The one that is not built from other people's opinions or other people's praise or the safety of a plan that never gets tested. The one that is built from the accumulated evidence of your own honest action in the world. Machiavelli did not write for the comfortable. He did not write for the people who wanted reassurance. He wrote for the people willing to look at reality without flinching and make their decisions accordingly. The goal was never to survive the storm. The goal was to understand the mechanics of power, psychology, and environment deeply enough that the storm eventually bends around you. You have the same choice available to you right now that every person who has ever chosen deliberate growth has faced at some point. The environments that are consuming you exist because you keep returning to them. The cage door, as it almost always turns out, was unlocked from the inside. The question is not whether you know that now. The question is what you do with it. And if you want to keep going deeper into this kind of thinking, the psychology underneath power, the strategic dimensions of human behavior, the things that most content never gets close to, then you already know where to find it. Right here on Silent Strategist.